Hey guys, what's up? This is False Bulls 123, and this is day 67 of my daily quarantine vlogs. Some of my words there, but what else is new? Now, I could be listening to an 8-track tape if I knew what an 8-track tape actually looked like, but instead I decided to say fuck that noise, and let's talk about anime. It is, once again, another Weeb corner. Wow, Ryan, you're doing a lot of Weeb shit lately. Have you been watching anime or contributing to your enrichment of Japanese culture? Bet you know I ain't been doing none of that. But I thought, we were talking about, harem anime last week, and I'm just like, it's been covered to hell and back by every person under the sun, but I haven't done it yet. Which means the market is not yet oversaturated, which is on brand. And so I thought, why not I just sit here, mansplain to you the Dere types, and then you think, wow, Ryan, I've just now realized you've only seen like 5 animes, and you shouldn't tell me about anime things. Well, too damn bad. You shouldn't have clicked on this video then. Anyway, now that I have stopped roasting my lovely audience, who was nice enough to click on this video, let's get into what the fuck a Dere is. Because I'm imagining you're saying to me, Ryan, I don't know that weird weeb speak you're saying, and it offends me. And so, I will try to explain. A Dere is basically a type of romantic partner, or romantic interest in an anime show, and usually the different subtypes of the character are described by whatever, prefix is used on the board. Dere is, let's see, the root word for the term, and I'm trying to remember what exactly it means exactly. I believe it means love struck, but do not quote me on that. But pretty much in harem animes, which are basically, if you didn't watch last episode, or pretty much just imagine a gangbang, but it's a rom-com, and you get a general idea of what it is. A lot of people, but no one's actually getting no titties, so maybe not the best description. But pretty much, a Dere is one of those love interests, and there's many different kinds. I picked, let's see, doing a little bit of quick counting, 7? Yeah, that's about 7. I picked about 7, really common ones, but I was doing a little research before the video, and there's apparently, 50,000, and I'm thinking, people need to stop being such hoes, because that's just making me feel sad and lonely. But let's get on to some actual, Dere types. So first up, if there is going to be the most commonly known Dere, that is a tsundere. And I realize perhaps it should be called a Dere type, but I'm American, and so I see things differently if there isn't a sub prefix in front of it. Sorry, English is a train wreck. What's a tsundere, Ryan? I don't know that word. A tsundere is one of the most common types of Dere, or Dere types, and that is essentially a woman. It can be a man as well, but generally most of these tropes are female-based. It's essentially a character who is very antagonistic or violent towards their love interest, mostly because they're using that as a front not to admit their feelings or affection towards the person. Though over time, as the person becomes more closer, you get past that sort of prickly skin, and actually they warm up to them. This has been used for a lot of effect in a lot of in a lot more comedic animes and a lot of other animes, but generally a tsundere is part and parcel for the medium. I'm gonna give examples for all of these types with animes, but if we are going to choose one that is from outside of the Western one, I'd probably say that Faye Whitaker or Whittaker is definitely considered a tsundere. And she is from a webcomic called Questionable Content, which is actually one of my favorites. It's written by Jeff Jakers. I'm going to put her face right there, but generally she could be considered a tsundere, and they actually make fun of that in the comic itself. That's where I learned the term from. But there are many, many others. I could probably think of a shit ton if I actually paid attention and looked for, my Crunchyroll, subscription. But the one I'm going to pick for today is Keiyo Akizuki, who is the chef from S-Blend. Now, you said, Ryan, like I said before, yeah, most of, Dere types are chicks. However, Keiyo is actually a male interpretation of this trope. one thing I really enjoyed about the depiction was that in S-Blend, I discussed it last week corner, so if you want more details about that, go check it out. But essentially, S-Blend is a show where you have these Dere types as sort of characters in this cafe. However, sort of the joke is that many of the waitresses that actually do play those characters have a completely separate personality beneath. It's a front. It's a personality that they play for characters. So in the show, the tsundere waitress, who plays the part very stereotypically, but also very well, is actually really sweet on off of work. But her love interest, who's totally into her but will not admit it, is the biggest fucking tsundere. And I love that irony that like her love interest, who's a guy, is the tsundere in the relationship. And I'm just like, that's nice. So I'm going to move on to the next type, and this one is probably one of the most interesting interpretations of the archetype, and that is a yandere. And you're thinking, Ryan, what's a yandere? That sounds like something. And a yandere is basically a yandere is essentially a sociopath, or I believe it might be psychopath would be the correct term, though I dislike using those phrases, since definitely in the context that we're speaking of, it does conflate mental illness and violence, but we're just going to move on from that salient point and actually discuss the trope. A yandere is essentially a character, usually a woman, who has become so obsessed to the point of violence towards the person that she's obsessed with. This is basically along the lines of, if I can't have you, no one else will. And it is generally used a lot in horror anime, and essentially the extreme side of obsessive love, which, if you remember your Greek forms of love, is one of them. So yandere is essentially absolutely obsessed with the person that they are into. Some great examples of that would be Yunogasai from Muraniki, or My Future Diary, I believe the English term is, who is quite famous. She's that pink-haired chick that says Yuki all the time. And another great example would be Asano something from Yandere Simulator, which is actually a video game based off of the trope. And if you've ever heard of Yandere Simulator, then I don't know where you've been on the internet watching anime things, because it's a pretty big thing. But essentially, one of the main things with yanderes is that they're basically batshit crazy, and they want that D, and they will stab everyone to get it. And so, it is a very disturbing character trope, and it's not used a lot of times in harem anime, mostly just because if there was another love interest, the yandere would stab them. But it is used a bit in anime itself, just to have that sort of interesting context. I think a yandere personality would essentially be the opposite of herbistophilia, if you really consider it. Instead of a person developing an emotional attachment to a violent or dangerous person, it's a violent and dangerous person developing an attachment to a seemingly regular person. So, basically, it's a stalker who will stab anyone to get that D. I don't believe I've ever seen a male depiction of a yandere, but I'm sure there's one out there. Anime is a wild and vast market of crazy bullshit and sadness. So, moving on to things that don't make me sad is the kudere. And you're like, okay, Ryan, that sounds interesting. Did that involve stabbing? It does not. A kudere essentially means a cool dere, and what that is essentially a very emotionless, very tuned down person who's just they're gonna talk to you, they're cute, but they aren't really somebody who is going to be, I guess, I'm trying to think how to describe it. Essentially, they're very shut down, they're a very emotionally distant human being. And so, there are actually a decent amount of representation for this trope. The one I immediately thought of was Rei Ayanami from Neon Evangelion Genesis. I have such a hard time saying it. You know, it's that blue-haired girl who doesn't really say anything, and she just looks sad all the time. And that's the girl. Other, let's see, representations of Kudere, now that I'm thinking about it, would actually, weirdly enough, Rem from ReZero. Even though you realize that, even though, like, after you've gotten to know her, she becomes much more than just her Kudere trope, but she definitely she definitely falls into that trope quite strongly at the beginning of her character arc. And I'm trying to think if there is any other character I can think of that really follows the Kudere personality trope. And at the top of my mind, I really can't think of one. Oh, just remember what it was. I was reading online and they mentioned that Violet Evergarden from the Netflix show Violet Evergarden is also considered a kudere, which I didn't really think about during the time just because it's not a harem anime. It's just, I don't know what to call it. I guess a drama. If you want to cry, watch Violet Evergarden. There you go. Just had an idea for a great, next week corner. But moving on. And so basically, kuderes are just very quiet and emotionally distant. We move on to the Dere, which is very similar to a kudere in the sense that they are both very reserved and quiet people. However, the Dere, instead of being emotionally distant or unfeeling, is shy. And that is really the sort of interpretation of the character. So if you want to sort of identify the Dere, really think of a sort of bookish character. One who is very heads down, very reserved, introverted, if you will. And so there are a few forms of the Dere. It shows up from time to time, though I don't see it as common as a character, mostly just because I feel it's not the most interactive of the character dynamics. And I feel that in most harem animes, there is a variety of different character interactions and dynamics that play off each other that actually cause the conflict and action in the show. But let's actually get to some character depictions of the Dere. So I don't really watch as much harem anime as I guess I put on, as I talk about, but one I immediately thought of was Miko Naoki from School Lives. And basically, Miko Naoki, she had some really intense trauma, but she is one of the more serious characters of the show. She spends a lot of time, head down, if a notebook, or she's reading a book the entire series. And so, really, her personality is very bookish, it's very introverted, and that really plays into the Dere stereotype. And so, and I keep saying this phrase is tropes and stereotypes and cliches, but essentially, Dunderes, or any other form of Dere, is really just a broad trope that these characters fall in. It's just like having a jock character or another sort of archetypical character in a Western TV show. We have to remember that tropes are tools. They're not good nor bad. It's simply a way to convey information to a audience effectively without having to have an excessive amount of world building. So, we're going to move on to my favorite Dere type, and that's the Dere, because it's alliterative and reductive? I don't know. And what's a Dere? A Dere, which is also known sometimes as a Genki girl, is essentially a happy-go-lucky, spontaneous, just very bright and bubbly, character. And so, I'm pretty much, if I was going to be an anime trope, I would very much be Dere, because I'm very bubbly, I'm very extroverted, and this would essentially be the exact opposite of the Dere type, who's very bookish and introverted. The Dere is very happy-go-lucky, very extroverted, and very outgoing. So, let's see. Okay. So, I actually have two references for this character type to get them in your mind. And that would be Tamaki Suyo from Ouran High School Host Club, which, if you remember correctly, is a reverse harem. And he is the leader of the host club. He's very bright and bubbly. He's blonde, which usually, it's not that the tropes necessarily have distinctive hair colors, but a lot of the times I do believe that the Deres tend to be blonde, which makes sense symbolically. Yellow is very bright. It's literally sunny. So it makes sense for the, visual comparison. And I apologize about my little cousin Steven. He just got back from the store, and so he's a little cranky. Anyway, moving on, we also have Yuki Takeya, hopefully I pronounced her name correctly. Now, don't tell you to gossip, sorry. And she is essentially the main character of School Lives, who is very happy-go-lucky. In this case, her personality trait goes from just being cheerful to rather naive, actually, which is a main part of her characterization and growth arc. And I'm not going to just talk about that more because that show has a lot of spoilers, and discussing it further will really just... don't want to give you too much out of it. So, moving on, we have two more Dere types that I'm going to mention, and I'm also going to give you a few bonus ones at the end. So, we'll have fun with it. The Hime is essentially a hearty, very better-than-you character type. I believe the term Hime is supposed to be reference to royalty, to be a princess type, and so she essentially thinks that she wants to be the bad bitch. She wants to be like everyone, to treat her like royalty. And so you can obviously get a sense of the character from those descriptions. She's very hearty. She's very arrogant. And so, obviously, that might not be the most favorite type of a lot of people. For me, that type of personality trait definitely rubs me the wrong way. Mostly just because I like to think of myself as a more humble rather than braggadocious character. Or person, not character. You know what I mean. So it's like, that's not my favorite trope. But let's get off of opinion and get onto those cold, hard facts. If I'm going to use a character reference to it, I would definitely say that Beatrice from ReZero definitely fits this type. Besides the fact that she is literally wearing a crown in her character design, she definitely has this very haughty, arrogant personality trope around her. Apparently, the Hime also is very famous for saying this, oh, like this sort of chuckling laughter. And that is essentially one of the more, I guess, distinguishing characteristics of the character. I forgot to mention it before, but the tsundere also has a sort of catchphrase for the trope, and that is generally the lines, "It's not like I like you or anything, but baka." And this is if you don't know, because you don't speak Weeb, baka is Japanese for idiot or fool. The translation isn't always exact. And so a lot of the times the tsundere means to be insulting. It would essentially be an equivalent of us saying like dummy or dumbass or some other version thereof. I've seen some translations of manga where baka is translated to the R word, but I feel, which would definitely be accurate slang-wise, but just definitely not kosher in today's vernacular. So I'm going to move on from that. I actually was doing a bit of research, and like Violet Evergarden, I saw another reference to a Hime type that I had never considered. So the manager from Oran High School Host Club, whose name I've actually forgotten, is apparently considered to be very much a Hime, which I had not really considered, mostly just because I forget she's a character half the time, and I feel like they play with that a lot in the show itself. But we're going to move on to my seventh Dere type, and that's the Sado Dere. And you're like, what's a Sado Dere? So a Sado Dere is essentially a sadomasochist. Or, I guess, is it a sadomasochist or a sadist? I've never really understood what the distinction was. And so that's essentially a love interest who is sadistic. Either from sort of the psychological point of which she is deliberately inflicting pain for some sort of shrenopeutic pleasure, or in this regular BDSM sense. And I've realized lately that I don't really have much of a, I guess, intellectual distinction with sadism outside of an erotic context, but I think there are definitely some cases in which there is sadism that isn't exactly meant to be titillating, which is its own discussion there. But essentially, a Sado Dere is cruel or mean or just mildly abusive to the character. The tsundere can be physically aggressive or violent at times. However, the Sado Dere is the more extremist version of that sort of interaction. So I don't know as many representations of Sado Dere, though I really wish I had taken the time to look up the characters from Monster Girl Musume, because there are some really fascinating characters in that story, and I would have loved to discuss how they fit in with the tropes. Maybe I can do that another time. Actually, I've been thinking about doing collabs with some of my friends, and I think that'd be a great time to actually maybe like voice chat and talk about the distinctions. But we're going to discuss, the only one I really could have thought of was also from Esplend, and And I know I've only really mentioned like 4 or 5 animes from these, but these are the ones that I was most familiar with when it came to the harem tropes. And so that is Mieka Sakura no Miya. Hopefully I pronounced that correctly. I am not Japanese, I cannot speak Japanese, and so sometimes the names are a little hard for me to pronounce, and I do apologize for that. Mieka or Micah? I'm just going to go with Micah because that's easy for me to pronounce. Micah is essentially this girl from Esplin, which if you haven't heard me talk about it, go watch the Weeb channel, my previous Weeb corner. And she is essentially a girl with resting bitch face. And so she basically gets this job at this cafe and the manager uses that resting bitch face to have her play the Sato Dere. And so she is very cruel and antagonistic towards her customers who literally explicitly kind of get off on it. Not like hand on the table happy ending get off on it, but like you can tell that they're kind of into it. And it's like, hey, boo boo, I do not kink shame. If you want to have weird sexual roleplay in a cafe while you eat your parfait, I want to judge as long as it is all FDA approved. And so those are pretty much 7 really common dairy types. It's not considered a dairy type, though it is a trope that is part and parcel with harems, and that is the lolly character. What's a lolly, Ryan? I wish I didn't have to explain this to you, but I'm going to. Lolly is short for Lolita, which if you are a classical fan, you may have recognized as that creepy novel about that dude who wants to kidnap children because he's a pedo. And so you're like, okay, Ryan, I do remember that novel, and it was super creepy. What does that have to do about anime? Well, let me explain. Essentially, in the book, the guy discusses this concept of nymphets, who are very young, precocious children. And so Japan culture saw that, and they're like, okay, let's just strip away the pedophilic eroticism from that concept, and just be very moe or cute about it. And so there is a lot of interpretation of very young or young-like characters who are essentially it's going to take me a second. Essentially, lollies are usually depicted as prepubescent children, or lolly is specifically feminine, shota is the male equivalent, and there are various different interpretations of that. There is the whole anime version of she's not a kid, she's a 9,000-year-old dragon, and so it's perfectly okay, which is not true. And then there are also just, other depictions, whereas, they're usually very... Sorry, I'm trying to get my thoughts together. In anime, there's generally 2 camps when it comes to lolly characters. Either they're, incredibly ancient, 4,000 or 35 in the case of S-Blend, and it's just a matter of, them, looking younger, or they are legitimate children, which, in either case, is a bit creepy. Now, there are 2 camps when it comes to lollies. And that is the one camp, which is essentially the basic moe, where it's people just thinking, oh, toddlers are cute, they like them when they dress up like Victorian dolls. And that's okay, you do you. If you just want a character who's bright and bubbly and there's always that fun kid sidekick character in shows, and so lollies can definitely fall into that category. And then there is the second disgusting camp known as lolicon, which is essentially... it's pedophilic. And there are some animes that do contrive to that taste, mostly just because anime doesn't really have, moral watchguards in the same sense. Anime is simply a medium in which some people use to draw really fucked up porn or other really messed up shit. And so it's kind of sick because a lot of people conflate all forms of the medium with just that fucked up tentacle rape with the lollies. And it is really a giant subdivide. And I think, there could always be discussions of things like ecchi and hentai and Japan culture and all that, but that's not the scope of this video. Pretty much, a lot of harems have some sort of lolly character, and that is mostly just because fan appeal. It's the same way that, a lot of children's cartoons have, the cool has, a cool bunch of cool friends and stuff like that. Or how, or similar to how magical animes have a giant friend group of women, all with certain personality traits that can appeal to young girls. So the lolly is the same sort of fan appeal type character for people that actually just that sort of cutesy moe character. I don't particularly like lollies as a character. I always think they're a bit weird, but there's definitely, like, it is part of the tropes for a variety of reasons. Most animes, like mainstream animes, do not have any form of sexualization or eroticism involving the lolly character. Usually the character is more treated as a younger sister character, where it is considered to be sort of affectionate in a platonic, fraternal sense. I just wanted to get that all out of the way because that's kind of the one thing that people really dislike about anime, and it's like a giant stereotype. It's like, oh, if you watch anime, you like watching CP, and I'm just like, nope. Not saying that doesn't happen in anime, but there is giant, vast distinctions between a depiction of a lolly character and looting the lollies, which is not okay. Now that we've gone past this really just very uncomfortable conversation about gross shit in anime, let's discuss two other fun Dere types that I found on the internet. By the way, there's a fuck ton, and most of them are just really weird or just why descriptions. See, Dere types are almost like Tumblr genders, and there's so many of them, and after a point you're like, you're just like, they need to draw a line somewhere. And if you say, and I'm not saying that, like, you can have a gender, that, like, people on Tumblr can't have, like, distinguished gender identities, but you should really look at some of the gender identities they have on Tumblr. There was one that was literally somebody being cisgendered, but they just didn't want to be cisgendered, and so they said that they were a different gender, but still cis. Like, they literally just, like, relabeled it so that they could feel special, and I'm just like, this is really bad. And I'm not talking about people being non-binary, I'm talking about transgenders. So I'm going to move on, but it gets to a point where it's like, there is so much proliferation of these subtropes that it becomes to the point of ridiculous and oversaturated. But moving on, there are two ones I thought were really fun, even though I do think they were kind of unnecessary as a trope, or that they really shouldn't have been termed as a Dere trope, but rather just their own established trope that already exists. First up was the Baka Dere, which is English translating to dumb bitch. Not to be, like, gender specific with the phrasing, but first thing up in my mind was Italy from Hetalia, and you're like, there was no romantic interest in Hetalia, and I'm just like, have you seen Hetalia? That's the gayest shit I've ever watched. And so, you can't tell me that Italy wasn't trying to get some Polish sausage, if you know what I mean. Moving on, the other one I saw was the Nyan Dere. Nyan is Japanese, it's essentially the onomatopoeia for meow, because, weirdly enough, different cultures have different interpretations of what sounds cats make. And that's kind of interesting if you think about it. And then I immediately thought about, I ain't going to say best girl, because, let's be honest, we all know Rem is best girl. But that would be Felix Argyle from ReZero. And that is just big cat girl. And you're like, Ryan, Felix is a dude. But I'm thinking, I'm pretty sure we all know that Felix is a chick. But definitely debate me in the comments, and also just remember traps is a slur and it is transphobic. Anyway, now that we've basically talked about the Dere types, I ain't got really anything else to talk about today, and I don't feel like talking anymore. I had a lot of time just bullshitting about anime and discussing all the weird shit that happens in anime. And I think that, as we go along, I'll probably think of, some other topic involving, the Weeb shit. That'll be really fun to talk about. I really like manga, I really like anime, even though I don't consume it as much anymore. And so I think it's always going to be a fun time to have sort of these, different types of corners in, my videos. And so, it's fun. I like doing this, this anime and manga style segments and just talking about things. If you have any other ideas or any other, questions about anime, about the Dere types, or about, any of this other stuff, please, comment down below and tell me if you have really interesting ideas about the prevalence of lolis in anime and the implications thereof. definitely tell me down below. Please be civil. Like, I do not want flame wars, even though I guess the evil businessman inside of me is just like, wait a second, flame wars equals, like, interaction, which equals, like, visibility. But, like, just don't do flame wars, be civil. And if you have any, like, other comments, if you want to, like, tell me just like I'm a terrible human being and I should die in a hole for watching anime, go ahead. I want to hear from you. You can always like and subscribe. I'll let you do that. Don't worry. And if you have any ideas for future videos, like, tell me that too. I'm going to run away now because I got shit to do and probably places to be if I'm being honest. And yeah. Tell your loved ones that you love them, wash your hands, do all that bullshit. And remember, this is False Fools 1, 2, 3, and I'm signing off.